This morning isn't just in light of these volatile times, if we can call it that. This is really something that we should always be paying attention to in our life. But in light of these times, it kind of enhances the awareness that I should probably pay attention to this more. Because, it is countless people now over months that, I've had individuals say, it's so easy to get kind of swept up and maybe worked up a little bit about what is happening in communities and in small towns, larger cities, what's happening in government and media and all of that. That, I find myself getting a little swept away, or my emotions, my thinking, it's affecting me and my attitude and how I'm dealing with people, or, maybe we shrink back from it and we just, it just affects us. And so one of the things I want to talk with us about this morning, and just trust the Lord's going to speak something to us that we can walk away with and remind ourselves during the week. And it has to do with this. It has to do with remembering our call. Because circumstances, hear this, circumstances never changes our call. Our call, your call from God, stays the same. It never changes until He changes it. There's some general calls for all of us as far as being a believer. Then there are some very specific calls that He brings into an individual's life that is just for them for a time, maybe for their life, maybe for a season, and then He, brings another call or specific direction for something for your life, a purpose, a plan for you. And so I want to talk a little bit about that, because we can easily be swept away and distracted by circumstances or things around us. And we, it makes the noise, it makes the disturbance, and our eye and our attention goes to that. And what happens when we assess that, we have a response to it or a reaction to it, and somehow we forget to look back at the initial thing that has directed our life, and that is the call from God. And so I want us to look at that. We'll see this, and you can see this in a lot of historical accounts of God's people and specific people throughout the Scripture. But I want us to glance at Moses a little bit this morning, and then we're going to glance at Peter in the New Testament briefly at the very end of this. And so, Moses, he's being raised thinking he's one of Pharaoh's sons, that he is Egyptian. And then, I'm doing a quick overview here. I know some of you are like, oh, he's going to bring up the Ten Commandments movie. He always brings up that Ten Commandments movie with Charlton Heston. And, well, that's not completely biblical, but it gives you a little bit of an overview and some things. So if you've never watched the Ten Commandments, the Helgersons would be glad to have you over. No, I'm kidding. If you've never seen it, get like 2 large bowls of popcorn. It's a long movie. Extra butter, all that. And anyhow, if you look in the book of Exodus, you'll see this. And you can start right at the beginning of Exodus. And it walks through what happened in history with a man and with God's people. And it continues to branch out in how it affects other people. But so the backdrop is Moses is raised as one of Pharaoh's sons. He's being raised as, he's going to be the next Pharaoh, basically. He had so much more favor than his sibling. And so, anyhow, then the realization comes that he's Hebrew, that these slaves that the Egyptians have, these are Moses' people. This is Moses' family, and he comes to the realization he's not Egyptian, he's Hebrew. And so now he has to go through this transformation as Pharaoh's son, but he's really Hebrew and was never, biologically Pharaoh's family or Egyptian blood. He's Hebrew. And so he has to go through this change, and he changes his attitude and his outlook, and he's looking at now his people who are being oppressed and they're slaves. And he one day comes along and, sees a Hebrew slave, his own blood, his family, his, God's people. And at that point, he knows that they call himself God's people, but he doesn't know this God and, just not sure where all that lands, but he knows that he's Hebrew and sees an Egyptian, beating and oppressing a Hebrew, and he looks around and nobody's around, and he takes this Egyptian and kills him, buries him with sand, thinking nobody's seen him until he comes to sort something out the next day between two Hebrews, like, hey, don't fight against each other. And they turn to him and say, why? Are you going to kill us like you did that Egyptian? And at that moment, he knew it wasn't a secret. Somebody saw him, the news spread, and so he fled, knowing that he killed an Egyptian and he is going to be pursued and his life will be demanded of him. And so he flees, goes across the desert, ends up in a place called Midian, and begins to dwell there and starts to shepherd flocks for a fairly wealthy man with flocks who was a priest of Midian, God's people. And so as he begins to live his life there, he sees from time to time that there's this glow on this mountain, and he has conversation about it with them, and etc. And unfolds. He says, I'm going to go up and I'm going to go face God if that's God. And that's where we hear and know the story, the historical account of the burning bush. We use that phrase like, it was a burning bush moment in our life. In other words, we came to a realization. Well, he goes and he sees this bush that is on fire but not consumed. And he hears a voice come, God's voice, calls to him, Moses, Moses. I don't do it quite like the movie, but that's just that moment, Moses responds, and they start to have this conversation. And it comes down to a moment in Exodus chapter 3, verse 10, and this is what God says to Moses. He says, come, I will send you to Pharaoh that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. It's his call. He says, come here, I'm going to send you. I'm giving you a job. I'm giving you a duty. I'm calling you to go. Come, I'm sending you. It's a call in and a send out. And this begins to happen, and then they have conversation, and Moses goes through excuses, and who am I, and, I don't speak well, and all these other things that, humanity comes up with, you come up with, I come up with, other people in the Bible come up with when they receive this call from God. They go through and sort this out, and Exodus continues, and you'll see the things that happen. And I want you to know, so here's Moses. He comes to grips with, and tells his employer, which is now his father-in-law because he married one of his 7 daughters, Zipporah, and they had a son, and Gershom is his name. And so here's this family and story unfolding just kind of like our lives unfold. You know, you work somewhere, you try to figure things out, you know that life's bigger than just yourself, and revelation comes, or you think it's coming, and now you got to make a change in how you live and who you are and what you do, even down to the point of, for him, he had this new call that changed his employment. You know, he was no longer going to be a shepherd of sheep. And so he packs up, breaks the news. They go back to Egypt because most of the people who remembered him and what he did, it says in the scripture, they died off. So he goes back. And he goes back to Egypt because God has called him to go. Goes back, and God gave him instructions on what to do and to get before Pharaoh and all of that, and tell him to let God's people go. And Moses is just trying to operate in the call. And, you know, he didn't get every detail, but enough direction from God, enough of an experience with God to respond and to do his best to obey and go through this change of life. Just like many of us when we hear God's call to come to relationship with him. And so this is unfolding in Moses' life. He steps into Egypt, and things don't go quite like he anticipated. How many of you have ever had that happen? Things don't really go. Even when you feel like God gave you direction, and you kind of go, I thought you called me to do this, and we had this expectation that it was just going to be easy, right? And then you realize, hey, not everybody's on the same page. Well, you have to remember, they weren't in the meeting. They weren't in the meeting between Moses and God at the burning bush. Just Moses was. Not everybody was in your prayer closet when you received this moment and revelation of God to follow him or do something he's called you to do or called you to become. They weren't in the meeting. They weren't there. Maybe they were in the room, but you were alone at the altar. Or you were alone at the dining table and the family was in another part of the house and you felt God calling you. They weren't in the meeting. They didn't know what happened between you and God. And they don't always understand. They're not always on the same page, and so they respond differently. Moses shows up, and Pharaoh is not the least bit interested in saying, oh, yeah, God sent you and told you to tell me to let his people go. Well, I don't know this God, and who does he think he is to tell me what to do, and why should I obey him? Moses goes, well, you know, like we would. Just a second, Pharaoh. I thought you told me this is what you wanted me to do and say, and now this isn't happening. It's not working. And then because of this, one of the results is the Hebrews, who he's trying to free because he's called to do it, the Hebrews get news that you have to make just as many bricks, but now you have to do it without straw. And now the Hebrews are going, thanks, Moses. Not only is Pharaoh not listening to Moses, now the Hebrew people who he's trying to free because of God's call to go do it, now they're not even interested in listening to him. Nobody's listening to him. In fact, he kind of feels like God isn't listening to him. He says, I showed up to do this and you don't seem to be doing anything. I'm out here on a limb and I seem to be sawing behind me. This ain't working out. And I want you to know that circumstances change and people have different views and all of this, but none of those things, you remember this, none of those things ever change the call. The stuff that you experience in your life and the volatility of our world, none of it changes your call. Now, circumstances can sometimes change methods. In other words, how we operate in our call. It might change the way we do the call. God directs us and steers us, but it never changes the call itself. Never. The call is the call. If you even look in the New Testament where, Jesus sends out his disciples in twos and go minister, and if some town doesn't receive you, the whole knock the sandals together and knock the dust of that town off, what did they do from there? They still carried the call and went to the next place. It never changed the call. Circumstances can come and go. People can be cooperative or uncooperative or disinterested or interested or, outwardly against you, or all the things in our life can go on. But I want you to know that none of those things ever change the call. What's happening in our world, community, and communities around and politically, it doesn't change our call. When we can be swept away by the influence of these things or the news of these things and things that affect us emotionally, even mentally, and might even, really put a burr under our saddle, and, we have circumstances that change things, none of it ever changes the call. Losing a job doesn't change the call. Moving neighborhoods doesn't change the call. Going from something that's easy to something that's difficult doesn't change the call. The call is really an anchor in our life. We have to understand that the call never changes. No matter what happens around us, the call is the same. And if we forget that, we will be swayed, because the call always provides direction and stability for us. And if we take our eyes off the call and the importance of the call and the priority of the call, now we're up for grabs. We're up for grabs. We remember some Christian philosophy, but we're really responding to circumstances inwardly, and now we're making decisions based off these circumstances rather than making decisions based off the call of who we're to be, primarily, and secondarily, what we're supposed to do. The call never changes. You say, well, I don't really know that I have a call. Well, let me just, maybe influence appropriately how you think about this. You remember Jesus and his first followers, his disciples. How did they get to be his first followers? He just said, "Come and follow me." They got a call. Here's your call. And then some of them threw down their fishing nets and said, okay. And they left commercial fishing to be a disciple. Matthew, or Levi, he stopped being a tax collector, which was a really crummy job on both fronts, because the Romans used him against his own people to collect their taxes, and he could pad his pockets with their money. So he collected taxes from his own people, and he was basically hated by his own Jewish brotherhood, and because he worked for the Romans. He left that and became a disciple because he heard, "Come and follow me." Well, I don't think our call is really any different. Jesus reveals himself. He finds us somewhere in life, and all of a sudden one day we hear the call. Believe in him, follow him, come. You can be forgiven. You can have a new life. And we're supposed to follow him. Then we have the call to become like him. And then we have the call to obey him or to do as he calls us to. First and foremost, how to be as a person, how we act and think and base our life. And secondly, what we do. What's he called us to do? What did he call us to be, and what's he calling us to do? So I want you to know that all of you have a call. Some of you might be here and say, I don't even have a relationship with him. Well, I want you to know that his will is that none would perish or not know him. And so I want you to hear the call this morning from the Lord to you. He's calling you to follow him. You have a call. Just like Moses had a call. And so I don't want you to be in this room and say, well, I don't have a call to go lead God's people, or I don't have a call to go do this, or I don't have a call to go do that. Well, I don't know that I'm doing anything spectacular. I work my job and try to be a good person, and, I go to church a little or check it out or whatever. I want you to hear his call to follow him. And in that call to follow him, you're going to hear the call to become like him. And then you're going to be given calls to do specific things in life. And he may not call you to leave the job that you have. You can still honor the call while you work at Tyson's or a factory or some office or for some institution or whatever it is. It may not affect that employment. But I want you to hear the first call to follow him, and then he's going to give you directives. And if you and I are swayed so much by what goes on around us or how hard it is or what different thing happens or what disturbs us emotionally, rightfully emotionally or mentally, or what's happening around us and we're just grieved or whatever it is, that those things never sway us from the call. The call doesn't change. So don't be swept away by these things. Remember first and foremost who called you and who we're following and who he's calling us to be and what he's calling us to do, regardless of circumstances. I want you to know it will be such an anchor to you. It'll bring such peace to you. Even in difficult times, it will just, because it is where we find security, stability, purpose, and direction. All of these, the circumstances didn't go Moses' way, okay, initially. But as Moses remembered the call, he banked on the call. He went back to the burning bush. He knows what he experienced and what happened. He remembers the voice. He remembers the conversation. He remembers the direction. And you know what? Circumstances come and go, and they can be frustrating. But they didn't change the call. It's what anchored Moses. It's what kept him from saying, forget this, and he just walked out. Yeah, was he frustrated? Yeah, you bet. Was he disappointed? Yeah, you bet. Did he feel a lot of human emotions that you and I feel? Yeah, you bet. But he didn't forsake the call, and he kept going back to the one who called him. And all of a sudden, through this, Moses was becoming who God was intending him to become, because God called him as a man and as a person first, and then to do the job. And God started to work this all out. And now Moses is seeing the call being fulfilled. The call was challenged, but the call never changed. And God, He proved that the call happened. I want you to hear this. When we get called, we think, how's this going to happen? How's this going to work? What does this mean? And we start to go through all kinds of questions. I want you to hear this. When you don't get an answer like you want an answer, or in the time you want an answer, as you sort through and begin to base your life, living it out on the call. I want you to hear this. Wherever God calls, He equips. Say it with me. Where God calls, He equips. He's going to equip you. And let's face it, He generally calls us to become something in our own strength we can't become. And basically, he calls us to things that we just can't do on our own. We need him. He calls us to be someone better than we are when he found us. He calls you to do greater things than just your gifting, or where your gifting runs into a boundary. It's not quite enough. And he makes it enough. Where he calls, he equips. Don't lose sight of your call. If you have failed your call, well, talk about this for a minute. If you have failed your call, you've kind of forgotten the call. I somehow allowed something to sway me that I acted or have become a person that I decided to become, and I took license blaming circumstance or a person or a situation to become this, and I know that this is different than really what God has called me to be as a person. Or you failed the call in the sense that you gave an attempt, and in your argument you said, well, I gave it all I had, it just didn't work out, God, so that call must be over. I want you to know that we all wrestle with those things, and I want you to hear a failed call. I want you to look at Peter. Peter's a disciple. He's one of the closest in relationship that we gather from Scripture, that, he's one of the three that are closer to Jesus. And we look through Scripture and we see Peter, he kind of bounces between some extreme things. I mean, he's kind of passionate. He's quick to react, all of those things. And yet, we see great revelation that comes through him. We see the great declaration of, Lord, I'll never deny you. Lord, you are the Son of God, who else are we going to go to? You're the one that has the words of life. And yet, Peter's there quick with his sword to cut off the ear of those coming to arrest Jesus. And we just look at other things, the storm's blowing and the waves are big and Jesus is walking on the water. And Peter says, if it's you, Lord, call me and I'll come to you. And he steps out of the boat and momentarily Peter walks on water. We look at these things. And then with the hour where it seems to count, Jesus is in his trial, going through his suffering before the cross. And Peter is recognized on 3 different occasions that you followed Jesus. You were with him. You were one. And he denies knowing Jesus. And Jesus gets crucified. And Peter's left knowing that he didn't stand up to the call because things were volatile and circumstances changed and this isn't working out like I thought it would, and Jesus is arrested and Jesus is suffering and he's on trial and it looks like he's going to be found guilty and they're going to crucify him, and now, want to distance myself and what I think is self-preservation, and I don't have to be embarrassed and I don't have to fail and I don't have to be associated with. And we go through all this stuff that makes all of a sudden conservative, because all this stuff has swayed Peter to forget the call. I want you to know the same thing can happen to you and I. I want you to remember the call doesn't change. Let it be an anchor. Let it be an encouragement. Let it be an assurance. Let it be a direction, regardless of circumstance. Time goes on, and Jesus is crucified, and Jesus raises from the dead. And Peter goes back with some other disciples, and they go back fishing. And the day comes, you find it in Gospel of John, chapter 21. And they recognize it's Jesus on the shore making some fish in the morning. And he calls out to them. And Peter recognizes it's the Lord. And so they eventually all make their way to shore, and they're having breakfast together. And Peter's still trying to deal with guilt and all the things that he felt and about denying Jesus, and I blew it. Forsaking the call. Wasn't the anchor for him like it should have been. And then the time comes over breakfast where Jesus, he's going to resolve this for Peter. He says, Peter, do you love these more than me? In other words, do you love these fish more than me? Do you really want to go back to fishing? You really want to live that life? Or do you love me more? Which do you love more? The life of fishing, your old life? Or do you love me more? Peter kind of probably semi-misunderstands. He says, Lord, I love you more. He says, then feed my sheep. He brings him back to the call. Peter, do you love me more? Do you love me? Asks him a second time, and Peter says, Lord, come on. I already answered this. I know, you know I love you. Jesus asks him a third time. And Peter gets frustrated. And Jesus says this, again, for a third time, he says, if you love me, then feed my sheep. Do what I've called you to do. Jesus is reinstating him. He's reminding him, you've had a failed call. You failed your call, but the call hasn't changed. Circumstances come and go. Your performance fluctuated. Yeah, you denied me. I told you were going to deny me, and you refused to believe, but I saw it already. Listen, I knew it. But hey, it hasn't changed anything. It hasn't changed your call. Because your call was not based upon circumstance. Your call was based upon the love of God and the decision of God for taking you from where you were and bringing you to a place of what you're supposed to be as a person in virtue and character, transformed by the renewing of our mind, to be able to know what God's will is. In other words, to know His call, how to live. Not being tossed to and fro like a double-minded man, like a boat on the seas, James writes. And Jesus reinstates Peter. And I want you to know, Jesus will reinstate you. If you have failed your call, or the call has no longer been the foundation from which you build your life and make decisions, and it's kind of been second, or it's moved to a back burner, not totally disconnected, it hasn't lost all its influence, but there's some other things that have crept in, swayed us. Our past, some history, some event, some passion outside of God's will, our humanity, hurt, pain, whatever it is. Jesus asks you this morning, do you love me more than that life? Because if so, do what I've called you to do. If you want to progress and recover from some failure, Jesus really gives us a recipe. We like recipes. because I just do what it says and this is the outcome. And we know that life has a lot of variables, but Jesus gives us a recipe here to reinstate, to recover, to be restored, to be reconciled from whatever has distracted us from the call to follow him. He says, do you love me? Do you love me? We like sentiment. We like emotion. I mean, not all of us like to show it, but we like that sentimentality of loving Jesus if you're a believer. And it should be part of our passion and for him as a person. And we can do that because he's a person. We get to have that interchange of relationship. But we also know that Jesus says this: if you love me, then answer the call, do the call. Jesus puts it another way in the gospel. He says, if you love me, you will obey me. If your children really love you, and we know that respect is a facet of love, then they will listen to you. Right? And when they don't, you feel like they don't respect your word, your direction, your counsel, and therefore you feel like you're not a priority or a priority voice in their life. And therefore we begin to process, not consciously, this all happens kind of how we're wired. All of a sudden we feel like we're not really loved by them like we should be, like we hoped, or like what's expected. And I want you to know it's the same track between us and the Lord. And so you want to restore getting back to the call and honoring the call and letting it be, the foundation from how you live and who you become and the decisions you make and the peace that you can have and the stability that you can have, that security, regardless of what's going on around you, that's trying to affect your life or sway you. Or when the emotions get you, but they can lead you somewhere, but rather you're founded in, I have to remember the call first. Remember the call. Honor the call. Love him and obey him. It's a simple recipe. Takes some effort, takes some cooperation, it takes some seeking him, but maybe we need to make the trek up the mountain to the burning bush. See, we'd like to just kind of live our life, make it easy, and have the bush show up wherever we're at. Moses had to make the trek up the mountain in his sandals. And I want you to know, it was not like there was this construction crew that came in, did excavating, paved the thing, made it nice, decorated it, and said, to the burning bush. He had to navigate that mountain. And you and I, in that, we have to make a decision to honor the call. We need his help to do it, but we got to make a decision. And that decision, doesn't come back on the table again as if, is that really my decision? No, we make the decision, and that never comes on the conference table again. It's not going to be discussed. It's only going to be remembered. I remember the decision I made, therefore, not, bring it back here. Maybe I want to change my mind. What will bring you peace? What will bring you security? What will be a warm blanket for you? What will be sure footing for you? What will be a light in dark times and fluctuating times is if you and I remember the call to follow, the call to become, and the call that he gave us, a specific thing to do. And until he changes that, we do that. If you say, man, it's been so long, listen, I want you to remember, go back to what he told you last. What he last told you, do. And if he changes his mind, he will tell you. because he knows where to find you.